Hello everybody and welcome back to Regency Rum Bluffers. We're in a very relaxed mood here at the moment, so I'm wearing my banyan and I've got another story for you. This time it's about not a well-bred military man, it's about a common man of the times, and he was called Richard Titherage. He was better known by the nickname of Dickey Dung Prong. And we'll come on to the story of why he's called that later on. But I found the information about him in a pamphlet in the Hampshire Record Office, and here it is. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but it makes absolutely fascinating reading. The story of a man who started from nothing and quite literally ended with nothing either. But in between, it was quite interesting. He lived between 1788 and 1834 and didn't have the best of starts in life when his father, who was a tailor, was murdered when Richard was aged 14. Now in those days there was no safety net in terms of support by the state, and his mother and the rest of his siblings found themselves in the workhouse as a result. Richard had never been the best behaved of boys, and even in the short amount of time he spent at school, he refused to learn how to read and write, and spent most of his time misbehaving with another gang of badly behaved boys also. So he was well known in the area for going and stealing apples out of people's orchards and learning a very impressive spread of swear words. So it was that when his father died and the family found themselves in the workhouse, Richard decided he was going to make his own way. Now, this chap had a set of remarkable skills, and he found himself work at a local stables and also working for a local butcher. And he proved himself to be a remarkable horseman. And he would be seen running through the streets of the town atop two horses standing on their backs, carrying his deliveries for the butcher, usually trying to make a hullabaloo about what was going on and taking the mickey out of everybody as he went along. Such a good horseman, he also found himself a job riding postilion on one of Collier's coaches. Collier's coaches ran from Reading to Southampton, and that route took the coach thundering past the front door of Jane Austen's cottage in Chawton. People could tell when Dickey was the postilion on the coaches because he had the most remarkable way of whistling, such that he taught a bird to whistle in the same way that he did, and somebody bought it because they were so fascinated by it. And the tunes he was whistling were so original that it was remarked in this pamphlet that came out years after his death that Dr. Chard, the organist of Winchester Cathedral, had made notes because the tunes were so original. There are other stories about his goings-on which I'll tell you about later, but let's move on with his life story, because in 1806 he went to Southampton and then enlisted with the army. And he joined the 20th Light Dragoons, and because he was such a good horseman, he became the Rough Rider, carrying messages where it was important to do that. And his first campaign was in Holland, but then, because of course it was the Napoleonic Wars at this time, he found himself going right the way through the campaigns in Portugal and Spain. And in fact he was involved at the Battle of Vimeiro. These battles, he was involved in a sword fight with a Frenchman who was rather a better swordsman than he was, and received several wounds and thought that he was going to die, but took advantage of a remarkable opportunity and thrust his sword through the Frenchman's mouth. So he was one of these people who kept going no matter what. It showed itself later on in an incident which was to save his life. Not then, but later on. And what happened was he was in a troop of horsemen when an officer came up who'd just had his horse shot from beneath him, and he desperately needed a mount in order to deliver some messages from one commander to another, and they were very important. but none of the troop would give him their horse, all except Richard. And Richard got off his horse and gave it to the officer, and then went and nicked another horse whose rider had been killed. Now, true to character, of course, he misbehaved whilst he was in the army, and during that time he suffered punishment, and of course it was a flogging army during the Napoleonic Wars. The sort of punishment he received was flogging, and he received 300 lashes for that. And also he was dungeoned and drilled and picketed twice. Now, picketing is the most horrible punishment, where the soldier is strung up by one wrist and left to dangle except for a small pointed stick underneath one foot. So he had a choice of either dangling from his wrist or standing on a point, and you'd be left there for maybe an hour or two by way of minor punishment. He later explained that the reason why he received this picketing was because he'd been rude to an officer and refused to apologise. Go figure. But that was the sort of chap he was. Eventually the unit was repatriated to the United Kingdom, and they landed at Fermoy in Ireland. From that point, I think he decided he'd pretty much had enough of military life, and so he stole his horse, wrapped its feet in cloth, and essentially went AWOL. He got to England by finding a job with a pig carrier, and then made his way eventually to Windsor via Winchester. And there he was found by another trooper who recognised him as a deserter. And this is the point at which he got his sobriquet of Dickey Dung Prong, because he was working in a stable at the time and had a dung fork cleaning out the stables. And when this trooper tried to arrest him, he attacked the trooper and stabbed him in the back with the dung fork and escaped from a window. He was, however, apprehended and eventually returned back to Cork in Ireland, and there he underwent a court-martial, for the desertion, he was sentenced to death. The execution had to take place in England, and so he was brought back to England. There he awaited his execution, and they put his coffin in his cell with him. Sort of chap he was, of course. He used the coffin to store things in and even slept in it. Eventually he was taken out for execution along with his coffin, stood by the grave, and just as they were about to send the final shot to send him off to his maker, there appeared an officer on a horse that was flecked with sweat from a journey, shouting, "Stop, stop, stop!" What had happened was, it was the same officer that he had given his horse during the battle, and having found out about this, to George III explained the situation and got him a pardon. He may have been pardoned, but the army didn't want him anymore, so he was dishonourably discharged and sent packing. And he went back home to his mother, who was then living in Alresford. However, that was in 1819, but his behaviour didn't really improve, because by the time he got back, he was, within a very short space of time, convicted of theft at Alresford and given 3 months' prison and ordered to be whipped through the streets. That punishment, he hadn't learned an awful lot, because by April 1825 he was again in Winchester, having been convicted of theft, and he was given 2 months in prison in Southampton Bridewell. By the time he'd spent his time in prison, he stayed in Southampton and made a living thereafter, selling fruit in the street, using his wit and character in order to engage his customers. But by that time he was failing, and the end eventually came in 1834, when his only set of clothes got wet. He caught a chill from it, and eventually he died. But before he died, he at last, after a life of sin, came to religion and made apparently a very, very fervent and genuine confession of all of his sins. These were all written down and eventually came to be the contents of this pamphlet. Within a year from his death, the pamphlet containing all of his manifest sins became extremely popular and sold out 3,000 copies in 3 days. It even went to a second edition a few years later. So there was something in it for somebody in terms of the story of his life. Unfortunately, it wasn't in it for him. It was for the priest who made notes of all of his terrible deeds. So sadly, crime didn't pay for Richard Titherage. It paid for his priest instead. Now, this pamphlet contains another section which is really good, interesting reading if you're interested in that sort of thing. And it has his anecdotes. What I'll do is I'll skim through this, and if you're interested, you can always catch it on the net. If you put in Richard Titherage or Dickey Dung Prong, this will be thrown up. After explaining that he was quite good at fighting bulls bare hand and did so on a couple of occasions, one section here. Richard was coming up the Dean in Alresford one day on 3 horses at full speed, with his feet on the outside horses, the one in the middle running free, hallooing out most lustily, "Fire, fire, fire," which caused the people to run out. Richard, seeing he'd accomplished his object in making what he considered fools of the people, laughed most heartily and loudly at their credulity. Just the sort of chap you want as a neighbour, isn't he? He was also good at pugilism. He was clearly good with animals because on top of his exploits with horses and bulls, apparently he was quite good with goats. We learn from several that Richard once exhibited much tact and skill in breaking in 2 goats at Southampton. He used to drive them about in a little 4-wheeled vehicle. He wasn't above a bit of poaching as well. Richard one night went on a fowl stealing excursion near Alresford and stole fowls on a farm and put them in a sack ready for sale next day at Winchester. One of the fowls, however, escaped death and began to crow in the sack several times in the night where he lodged, which made him hasten down to dispatch it, preventing at that time a discovery of this nefarious deed. His character also worked sometimes to his own disadvantage. Here's another wonderful example. On one occasion he was taken up for stealing watercresses from a man who got his living by selling them, and sentenced to a month's imprisonment. On coming out of the room, he foolishly struck the man, which caused him to be taken back and another month added to his former sentence. He wasn't very good with the ladies either. How about this passage? It is positively affirmed by many in Alresford, who still remember Dickey's acts, that the woman is still living in Alresford with whom Dickey kept company and seduced under a promise of marriage and then deceived. The woman has now a large family and is married to a steady and industrious man. I know her well, and she admits that Dickey was her former paramour. There are more examples in this little pamphlet, and they do make amusing reading. So if you're interested, have a look on the net. It's there for all to see. Well, that's it. There's another story for you. Trying to keep you amused during all of this lockdown. But stay safe. See you again at Regency Rum Bluffers. Bye.